Welcome to the Lions Man Podcast, episode 42. Today, I am joined by a friend and colleague, Alex, and he's going to introduce himself in a few minutes. He is an assistant coach. Did I get that right?
That's right.
He's an assistant coach, but he does a little bit of everything. So we're going to talk about college, what people look for collegiate athletes and the level of collegiate athletics, and especially in women's soccer. And I'm really excited about this conversation because this is close to my heart as a former player. So thank you so much for coming on, and please tell the people who you are.
Yes, I'm Alex Ng. I'm currently an assistant women's soccer coach at Indiana University in the United States. And basically my primary role on staff is to oversee everything from a sports performance standpoint. So I'm the liaison between the strength coach, the athletic trainer, our nutritionist, and the sports science department. So I kind of have my toe in everything that has to do with player development.
That's freaking amazing, first of all, that you have all of those things, but that also I'm sure that's a balancing act, kind of juggling all of those directions, all of those people. What is that like what does your day-to-day look like when you're at school? Obviously now it's Corona and the holidays, but what does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, Corona has definitely changed it, but I think I like to think of myself as the in-between Erwin, our head coach, who he kind of gives me his framework of what he wants. And then me having a background, I have my degree in exercise science. I hold my CSCS. I kind of take that and then kind of make it to where it's going to be the most practical for one, college women's soccer, and then our group of players. So if there's a time where Erwin, I'll give my opinion and say, hey, I think we should be doing this. He'll say, yes, absolutely. I think you're right. Or, hey, maybe do it this way. And then I take those ideas to all those departments and say, hey, what do you guys think about this? Because we have unbelievable resources at Indiana where I can take a rehab thing to our athletic trainer and say, hey, what do you think of this? And be like, oh, I think that's unbelievable. We'll implement that right now. Or like, hey, maybe we can do this in the off season or when we're not playing games, something like that. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of create a framework for our strength coach to develop what we do from a warm up, a periodization, a strength and conditioning standpoint and lifting. And then with our sports science department, they kind of handle all of our data. So we collect a lot of different data from force plates, heart rate, GPS, obviously, and then we do velocity-based training, wellness questionnaires. So they kind of help me take all those numbers and kind of make sense of it, which is, I definitely think I'm very spoiled because I'd be like, hey, can I have a graph to see our wellness data from the past 3 months, 2 days, and I have a chart in front of me. So I'm definitely very, very spoiled in that end where I have all this data collecting. And then I think that's the most unique part about us is that we're using it. I think every program has heart rate GPS data, but might not have someone on staff that knows how to analyze it and kind of use it to help our athletes develop. So I think we are in an unbelievable place to where, one, I can use that data, but then I also have the resources to generate that stuff for me.
That is freaking awesome. It's like a dream come true for most of us sports scientists, baby. But it sounds like you're also the creative kind of in the middle where like you have access to all these things and they're theoretically all available to you and everybody has an idea and everybody has a concept, but you have to somehow bring all of that together and make it happen for then the athletes. How does that work?
For sure. I think a lot of trial and error. I think for us, the base is soccer. So I think everything comes with how we can make you a better player. I think this might not go over well with a lot of strength coaches, but I think if we can lose out on a little bit of physical development for soccer, we'll do it. Like if we're in a periodization cycle where, oh, we have to hit this number today, but they did really bad in that last set. We need to do one more set to make sure they got better at soccer. Yeah. I think we're not afraid to do that. And I think that's something that separates us because I think a lot of sports scientists and strength coaches get into like a very, very blinders and just do exactly what we need to do from a ideal world. And soccer is not an ideal world. I think it's so chaotic and everything is so different. And I think the other thing is that like, especially at the NCAA level where we have such a unique calendar and such a unique game cycle when we're in season in the fall, that traditional periodization models aren't really realistic. Like when can you really program a strength phase when they're out training and playing games all the time?
No.
So I think that traditional model of like hypertrophy, strength, speed, all that kind of stuff, I think is not realistic in our environment. So I think that piece of trying to figure out like, because obviously that's what most college strength coaches are used to. Like, hey, these are our cycles. This is how we program. But we have to shift that for the betterment of the athletes, right? There's no way that we can do some of these phases when soccer is just such a concurrent training. Like you're hitting everything, right?
Yeah.
You're hitting max speed every day. You can't avoid it. You're hitting a lot of changes of direction.
Everything's done at max intensity.
Can't avoid it.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you can't avoid it. So like, we're not going to do a max strength day after a 11s training session.
No.
Right? Like there's no benefit. So it's finding a way to integrate both our periodization on the field and our periodization off the field. So I think that takes a lot of communication and a lot of collaboration between all those departments. And I think that's the biggest thing of, like, I don't know everything. So I try to get everyone's opinions and try to figure out what's the best thing we can do, because the sports scientist is going to have a slightly different opinion to our strength coach, to Erwin. Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, Erwin trusts me that I'm going to try to push for the best decision for the athletes. But it is difficult sometimes, because sometimes it's not a right or a wrong answer that I'm trying to find. It's like a gray area where, like, okay, what's going to be better?
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely
that's when you're looking at like risk and reward, kind of.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. It's like, do we want to push them in this week when we could, but if someone gets hurt, then we don't have them for the game next week. Mm-hmm. So it's finding that balance of, yes, we could push them to develop a little bit more here, but what's the reward of, yes, they might get incrementally better, which is what we search for, but we also need to maximize their availability also. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of my two overall goals, is maximizing the players' availability and then maximizing their potential and their ability to achieve their peak performance, which is a tough balancing act to do, especially with how our calendar and our schedule is.
The NCAA calendar is not an easy one. It's very similar to the Bundesliga calendar here in Germany, where it's like, how do you play twice a week? We play 30 weeks a year for the most part, not including tournaments. And then you have summer tournaments and whatnot. And it's just like, when we talk about peak performance and consistent peak performance, because that's really what peak performance is, you can't just hit it one time and then come back down and call it your peak performance. It has to be some level of consistency that, like, it's such a balancing act of all these different things, which is basically what you're explaining. And that sometimes, which, first of all, it sounds like your head coach is freaking amazing. He sounds incredible. And it sounds like you have an incredible team. But how do we balance, like you said, having the athlete at the forefront when there's so many different factors to actually help them keep that peak performance? And you have this really unique position of being coaching staff and looking technically and tactically, but also like physically and mentally, and having all of these resources around you. So how do you build consistency like that?
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, every decision I make is based on those two goals, and then also what's best for the athlete. So I think at the end of the day, it's what is going to make them better and keep them on the field. And from a consistency standpoint, I think it's tough because every player is going to be different. Like, we're not going to treat our goalkeeper and our outside forward exactly the same in anything we do, really.
Right.
So I think the consistency standpoint, I think the consistency comes from the individual. So making sure each individual is consistent with what they need. Okay. I think that obviously I think I'm able to do that because of all the resources I have, because I don't have to go make charts. I have the sports science department to help me do that. So I'm able to individualize it a lot more. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the unique part of my position, is that I'm able to do, the future of sports performance is individualization. Yeah. Right. Like, that's where it's going.
That's why we test.
Has to be, everything is about what their testing numbers are, where we can improve, where we can correct. And I think that we're able to do that on such a specific level because of the resources that we have, that we can do that. Because I have the time to make these individual development plans, to look at each player on the roster every day and say, hey, is she doing what she needs? Is she getting what she needs? And what we can change going forward.
That's so fascinating. And again, I'm so fascinated by your position in the coaching staff specifically because, and I'll bring this up 1,000 more times, Alex, I swear, because as a strength coach and sports scientist, right, I look at I think we tend to get caught up in their physical development, and they could lift more weight and that could theoretically make them faster, or we could sprint more but that would make them tired, blah, blah, blah. And we focus so much on the physical component. Head coaches tend to focus more on the technical, tactical development. Sure. The mental piece gets thrown in there as well. And we're all kind of looking after our own interests. And so to have somebody on the staff who takes all of those pieces and is like, at the risk of losing a bit of physical development, in, pushing them this week. We're going to peak them next week so that they're all available, and that will be better for the team as a whole and the individuals. And that's something that we lose out on so much. So I see that as a gift. That's amazing.
For sure.
That the primary piece is the athlete's health, and then the athlete's performance as a whole across time is awesome.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty complicated setup that you guys have there. What are the demands of the sport in your eyes for new prospects coming in? Just for context for anybody listening, we have a lot of Germans young Germans who live to go play in the States at collegiate level. And the European strength and conditioning system is not everything that it should be, especially not here in Germany. And sometimes our athletes get a little bit lost, or maybe a bit underprepared, not entirely sure what to expect from being recruited, and then the physical demands of the US system. So could you explain a little bit to us, like, you guys have this really complex puzzle. How do new players fit into something like that?
Yeah, so what a new player would traditionally come into is a fall season. Mm-hmm. Which would start last week of July, first week of August traditionally, and you get 10 days before you can play matches. So you get a 10-day preseason where, with all respect to all other coaches in the country, I think a lot of them just do a lot of two-a-days to try to get that technical, tactical development like you talk about. Mm-hmm. And they think they're managing the physical side, but a lot of times they're not. And you see it where a team, they had 4 ACLs in preseason. It was a 10-day span. So it's like, what you have to, like, how are they not self-analyzing and like what went wrong? Mm-hmm. So I think that part is something that players have to get used to, because most of the time you're doing two-a-days, which I think there's pros and cons, but I don't think you do that many of them in that span. And then you start matches. So basically from then on, you're playing 2 matches a week for 8 to 10 straight weeks. Mm-hmm. Maybe with a single game week in the middle of that, if you're lucky and your conference has a decent scheduling system.
Probably not.
So that'll take you into the last week of October, into November, depending on how far into your conference tournament and NCAA tournament would be. And then you get basically a little period off. You come back in the next semester in the January period, and you basically have traditionally maybe a month and a half of pure training. Mm-hmm. And then you get 5 games in the spring semester, which most coaches will take in that March-April period, later in the semester, so they can train and then get into 5 matches in the spring. These don't count towards anything; they're more exhibitions. Mm-hmm. And then after that, the players will go away in the summer, and most players will play on a summer team. Whether that's in the States, they can play on their summer team, or depending on where they're at in Germany, they can play matches over there. Mm-hmm. So that gets very, very, there's a lot of high intensity periods, and then on your own to do whatever you want periods. And I think that's something that you have to get used to, because you go from a fall season where you're 4 months of very, very structured, you get exactly what you need, and you have people helping you. Then you have 2 months of, hey, you got to do this on your own now. But I think the most important thing is you have to be passionate about this game. Because if you're not going to take care of your body. You're not going to have the detail in what you do to take care of yourself. So I think the ability to have detail and taking care of your body comes from a passion for the game. Because if you're not passionate about what you're doing, you're not going to do it. And there's no way around that. If you don't,
it's just too hard.
If you don't love this, it's not going to happen. So I think the base is the passion, but you just have to have a detail and how you're taking care of your body from a recovery standpoint. I think recovery's become such a big thing in soccer because of all these hypervolts and massage guns and all that stuff. But I think I love those things. I have a hypervolt myself, but I think if you're not getting 8 hours of sleep and eating what you need to be eating, you can go sit in massage boots for 12 hours. It's not going to do anything.
That's true.
So I think that's one of the big things that we emphasize to our athletes is the base of your recovery is sleeping and nutrition. And that's why we have an unbelievable nutrition department that helps them with that gives education, that they can communicate, make individual meal plans. And I think that piece is, the recovery is so important, but having the right recovery, because recovery isn't after training, go ice bath and then go massage yourself. It's making sure you're doing something 24/7. It's not the immediate post or pre-training.
Yeah.
So I think taking care of your body is a very, very important part of playing in the US, because there's just very, very heavy periods of a lot of fatigue. And like in the fall, most of our sessions are managing fatigue.
Yeah.
And that's like, there's really not many technical tactical sessions. Like, yeah, we'll prep because it's managing fatigue and prepping for the next game or reviewing the last game. And that's it.
There's only so much you can train.
Yeah. Cause we have to have one mandatory off day. So our weekly schedule is we have Thursday, Sunday games. We'll take Monday off. So we'll have training sessions basically Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, which one is a match day plus one, one's a match day minus one, all at all times on one way or the other. So you look at I always do research on like, periodization models, and everything's on one match a week. Like, oh yeah, match day plus 3, you want to do this. I'm like,
we don't have one of those.
I have a game. I have a game. Yeah. I have a game on match day plus 2. What are you talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That even agile periodization doesn't really fit what you guys are doing at all.
Nope.
And so learning to manage fatigue, let's dive into that, because like you said, recovery is really important. How do athletes themselves manage fatigue once they've got, their sleep down and they're fueling the way that they need to fuel? Are there other ways to manage internal states, basically?
Yeah. So I think even like taking a step back from that is making sure you're working that way in training. So I think in those periods where we don't have matches, making sure you're basically developing your base of high intensity actions. Because I think a lot of players think that staying fit is going to run 5 miles a day, when it's not. It's sprinting, recovering. And it's I think a lot of athletes, like, especially from your sports science standpoint, I think they're comfortable, or from your sports psychology standpoint, I think they're comfortable just doing those long, slow runs. I think that's what they like. That's what they're comfortable with. It's what they've always done. And there's definitely a component of like, if it makes you feel good, go do it. But you go run 8 miles, it's making you slower.
Yeah.
So it's, I think that part is in managing fatigue is one, knowing what you need. And I think that's part of my job. Like if they don't know what they're supposed to be doing or what they need, and making sure they want to do it. So it's not just handing them a program, hey, this is what you need to do. It's educating them on, hey, this is why we're doing it. This is how we're doing it. I think that piece of managing fatigue is more on the front end of the development, and making sure that we can minimize the fatigue by maximizing their abilities to generate those actions. And for me also, when I analyze, not fitness, but a lot of what I do is managing those soccer actions. So everything we're developing is we want to develop their ability to perform soccer actions, whether that's ball striking, sprinting, change the direction. But after that, of when we're in games, I think nutrition, sleep obviously is the base of my pyramid in recovery.
Yeah.
And the other
you can't
side
get away without those two things.
No, there's no way around it. I think the next level is kind of the psychological and low impact exercise. So I think that like an underrated part of it is the breathing, the stress management, because people forget that they're in a 2-game-a-week season, and then they have exams in school and social stresses. So I think managing those outside stresses, because if you can minimize, or if you can manage your personal and school stresses, I think it goes a long way in your physical recovery. Because there's, you probably know the scientific part more than I do. I think I'm still figuring out the hormone development of, if you're stressed, you're not recovering.
Yeah.
So I think it's the ability to have your stuff together to where you're not stressing about, oh, I forgot to do an assignment, I forgot to do this, I forgot to do that, of making sure you have a plan. I think that helps, goes a long way in recovery.
Yeah, that you're not living your life on
side,
high cortisol and adrenaline, basically.
Exactly. And then I think the other side is the pre-post training routines, whether that's individual or it's how I program the warm-ups, and making sure that we take the results we got in the wellness questionnaires, and hey, if 90% of our team has an increased quad soreness, maybe that's something we can focus on a little bit more to make sure that they don't have an increased quad fatigue during the session. We're trying to manage that. And then post-session, of making sure you get your nutrition immediately post-session, having a decent cool down, making sure that you're not going to run immediately after training, which I don't know if you've ever had that issue, but I have. You're like, oh, I didn't feel like I got what I needed out of training. I go for a run. It's like, then work harder in training. Yeah, so work harder in training. What's your, I don't know where the disconnect is.
Like I'm not tired enough, so I went for a long, slow run. It's just like, okay, this is all of this is wrong, but okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. So managing fatigue and training basically sounds like a complete dichotomy. Like, how do you manage fatigue while you're fatiguing? But that actually, to us, makes sense. Sports scientists makes sense. Um, let's dive into the wellness questionnaire that you keep bringing up, which is really fascinating. That's not something that's
Sure.
super developed here. They're just like main clubs here in Germany have those, and I think even in the States, not every school has that. I mean, internal load, we think about GPS, heart rate monitoring, and those things that kind of cross over between external load and internal load, even like HRV and force velocity training, those kinds of things. Are we measuring the work, or are we measuring the adaptation? And that's kind of being the difference between external and internal. So how do you guys measure that internal state? What is a wellness questionnaire? How can our athletes tell us better how they're feeling and how they're adapting?
Yeah, so I think the third component is kind of the perceived exertion, like how
Mm-hmm.
they're feeling.
Totally.
I think the most important part is building the athlete's trust. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's 90% of the game, because we can have the perfect question, the perfect answers that you have, the perfect scale, but if they're
Yeah.
not giving us what they actually feeling, I think it's useless.
Useless.
So I think it's educating them on like, hey, this isn't like, if you tell us you're really sore, we're not going to immediately pull you out of training.
Right.
If you tell us that you're not in a good mood, we're not going to completely ignore you and be like, oh, she's not in a good mood, we can leave her alone. I think for us, it's a conversation starter. Like, hey,
Yeah.
if her mood's been trending down, like just have a conversation. Hey, what's up? Like,
Yeah.
just have a conversation. I think the other side, like I mentioned in the warm-ups, is if there's an increased soreness at a localized place for a big number of people, I think we
Mm-hmm.
can do that. I think from an injury rehabilitation standpoint with our athletic trainer, he can go back and see, okay, how's their pain level. So our questionnaires are kind of different depending on our period.
Mm-hmm.
But in this purely training period with COVID, our questionnaires were overall mood, pain levels, and then there's a body map. Like they can
Mm-hmm.
click where their pain levels are. And I really encourage them to put that, because it's like, if you have a slight pain in your right foot, we're not going to pull you from training. We just want to know, so that
Right.
me and our athletic trainer can just be aware of it. Or we have one, it's actually one of our Germans. She has a chronic groin issue when
Okay.
she ball strikes. She's left-footed. She has an unbelievable left foot, but she has some chronic groin issues. So I think if she goes during a week on a Monday, she puts a 1 out of 10 in soreness, then Tuesday's a 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10, 4, to be like, okay, maybe on Friday we need to watch her ball striking and limit
Yeah.
that. And figure if we're doing a passing pattern or ball striking, like we maybe pull her out of that. It's not
Yeah.
pull you out of an entire session because something's not right. It's,
Right.
hey, what can we manage on your individual basis to
Exactly.
make sure that player availability, making sure that you're available to play and not pulling your groin because we saw it coming. And I think that's the worst part. And like, people make those mistakes. I've made those mistakes of, we saw something like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. Like, even with these questionnaires and seeing it,
Like it's trending.
okay,
Oh, yeah.
it's okay right now, but it's finding that gray area of when we need to intervene. I think that's the biggest thing, is like not
Yeah.
intervening too early, not intervening too late. And then
It's
so
a,
there's
a tricky game.
for sure. So there's a pain and soreness levels. There's a body map for our athletes to pick where it is, because like they don't know what their IT band or what their medial
Right.
glute is. So it's
Right.
just giving them, hey, where are you sore? So I think that part is a really big part of what I do, because it doesn't get more athlete centered than that, of
True.
how you feel. And then there's and then we rate each session of just 1 to 10, how hard they felt that session was.
So RPE basically.
Um, yeah. So in last semester, we made that even more specific.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot how we worded it. So the other part is like the wording of these questionnaires is so important,
Mm-hmm.
because you can definitely affect how they're responding to it by how you're wording the questions. But I think from an RPE standpoint, we said like, how difficult was it muscularly versus cardiovascularly for you? So like, if we're playing an 11s day or a small sided day or a heavy 1v1 day where there's a lot of sprint recovery, they can kind of tell us of like how they felt. And then we obviously have what we tried to do. So it's kind of always self-evaluation of kind of retroactively looking at, hey, did we do what we wanted from the player standpoint? Not necessarily did we hit the numbers, like did we get what we wanted out of them? And then it's combining, if we see someone's very, very stressed out for a long time, and then their fatigue and their RPs are trending up, that's something we want to look at too, because that's a unbelievable indicator of, hey, something's about to happen, something
Yeah.
bad could be coming. So we need to make sure we're watching that athlete. So I think it just goes back to the individualization and making sure the players are available and can hit their peak performances with those wellness questionnaires.
So you use this data to adjust to the players for the players instead of making the players adjust to you guys, basically.
Yeah, I never thought of it in that frame. Yeah, I think there's always a level of making sure they can play to our game model.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, it is about them and making sure they're available to do what we need them to do. So I think it's definitely a two-way street of, we have to make sure that they're available and capable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's where the technical tactical comes in of like, you could run less if you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
So then
True.
there's that end of, if you know what you're doing, you don't have to run as much, depending on the position, obviously, or you're running more if you're center forward pressing.
There's always going to be a time. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
But they knew that before they started. So it's
Exactly.
their own fault. But that's so fascinating because a lot of times the feedback I get from athletes is, well, I don't want to answer this honestly because coach is going to pull me out. If I get pulled out of training, then I won't be able to play. I'll be on the bench. I don't want to be on the bench because then I'll lose my I might not get re-signed next season, or I'll lose my chance to get nominated to the national team, or whatever it might be. Just fears of, I don't want to be less than, I don't want things to change, whatever, at their own risk, basically, at the sake of, you could get injured. You're not, this isn't healthy for you. This is causing you external stress, or extra stress, I should say. And it sounds like the way that you're saying it is, that's not what we want. We want these honest answers and these inputs, and we use this data then to shift, because we know what we want out of the athletes, and you're using the data to basically shift how you get that out of them, how you get their peak performance out of them, instead of basically tricking them into, I'm not going to play you now because you have groin problems or you're got groin soreness. No, instead, we're just not going to make you strike a bunch on Friday so that you can play again on Sunday and feel better.
I think that's just the trust and the education that you can provide for the athletes. And it's always a running process, right? It's not just an initial, like, hey, this is what we're doing, why we're doing it, boom, we're done. It's a running process of, because you always have new players coming in, you always have different situations, because you could have an athlete in the program for 3 years and never have any issues. And then, she develops a little bit of an issue here. Like, is she honest then? So I think it's building the trust, not only with each individual, but with the group in general, because how all of them feel about it. If 80% of the team doesn't like it and feels like we're not using it correctly, the 20% that thought they trusted it aren't going to.
Right.
So I think it's a constant process of educating them on why we're doing this and how we're using it. And then it's just the relationships with the athletes.
That's amazing, actually. And it takes, I think, big coaches to do that as well, because coaches always have their own ideas and experiences and whatnot. So to be able to get on level with the athletes and be like, hey, we're going to just have a discussion about this is really important and really cool. So back to general concepts about recruiting. I know we're not going to get too specific about this. You've given us a lot of ideas of how you guys' program works and how the NCAA is as a whole. Super competitive, very intense, high level, and then it just kind of drops off afterwards. What can players do to get in shape for something like that? Like, that's something that's totally different. Like, you don't get that in leagues usually. You usually play 2 seasons, fall ball and spring ball. You definitely don't get that here in Germany because we play year round. How do you help players to adjust to that besides that 10-day period, which is very short?
Yeah. So I think it's providing them the resources while they're not with us, creating a program that, one, hits everything that they will need, which I think for me, like, especially in a shorter period, I think it's sprintability, because you're going to lose your ability to hit max speed way faster than you're going to lose any endurance you have.
Yeah.
Making sure they're maintaining that. And then, like we said, with those groins, I think it's ball striking is one really important thing that I don't think a lot of people emphasize in those vacation programs, is that you got to strike a ball, or else you're going 5 months of just running and sprinting and you haven't had the stimulus. You're going to come straight into having that stimulus every single day for 2 hours a day.
No.
So I think there's a lot of things that they can do to protect themselves. And then I think it's having the commitment to follow the program, especially now in COVID times where it's harder than ever to go outside, find a field, find a public area to do these exercises or find a gym to get into, which is even harder than finding a field to get outside in.
Yeah.
And then I think it's on my end is developing something that they want to do, right? So I think you can't, if you just make the ideal program that nobody really likes, no one's going to do it. So I think it's definitely tough to find that balance of creating something that they want to do and then making sure it hits everything that they need to make sure they stay prepared. And it's always working, and like they're going to take off days and they're going to have recovery days. So it's making sure we can program that in where they can see, okay, if I follow this program, I have breaks. It's not a 7-day-a-week thing while they're gone.
They're not going to murder you.
Exactly.
Wow. I have so many questions, but my last question for you is, how can athletes learn how to trust their coach? I know it's a two-way street, but it can be hard. There's different kinds of coaches. There's different kind of athletes. How can athletes, especially new ones to a new program, how can they learn how to trust their coach? What do you look for that?
Yeah, so I think obviously it starts with the coach. And I think that if the coach isn't well-versed in verbalizing what they're doing and what they're thinking and why they're doing it, obviously the why is the biggest part. You can tell them what we're doing and how we're doing it, but even from a technical tactical side, you got to tell them why. Especially athletes nowadays, they're going to question everything. So you have to have a good understanding of what you're doing as a coach first before you can do it to the athletes, because they're going to ask why. Especially from the sports performance side of things. If you're doing an exercise and you can't tell them why we're doing it, then there's no trust. But I think from an athlete's point of view, I think it's not taking prior coaches' experiences into your next environment, your next coach. I think it's making sure that you have the ability to not start fresh, because obviously you're going to hold that and have, because I've heard a lot of stories of athletes just not having great strength coaches or sport coaches and just coming in with a really poor taste in their mouth. So
which is human, but still.
For sure. I mean, that'll go down to the society in general of how, of trust and reliability. But I think it's being able to start fresh. And then the other side is ask why. I think that's how you build trust, is having communication with the coaches. Because if you're never talking to your coach, how can you build any type of trusted relationship? Because it's a two-way street. It's not just the coach always going to you, hey, how are you doing? You could ask us how we're doing every now and then. Come to me and say, hey, how's your day? How was your weekend? So I think the relationship building is a two-way street. And a lot of athletes don't understand that. And I think it's not always the coach's responsibility to come talk to you. And I think that's a really, really big thing that a lot of athletes, part of it sometimes is maturity and like a youth issue, but just walk up to your coach before a session or something, just have a conversation. Doesn't even have to do with what we're doing today, soccer, sport performance, anything. Just have a conversation. And I think that relationship will bleed into it, because you'll get a feeling for who that person is and why they're doing what they're doing. So I think that part of building trust is really important. And then, just ask why and see what their answer is. And I think that will show you how you can build trust, because you'll get a feeling of what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Brilliant. I can totally understand why it's hard as a 17, 18, 19-year-old to learn how to advocate with yourself with a full-grown adult when you're in a new situation and stuff like that. But you're right. Relationships are always two ways, and the coach is also a human being and has other interests outside of soccer as well. And the best kind of coaching relationships are actual relationships instead of just a work relationship.
For sure.
Yeah. Freaking awesome. My mind is blown. Like I said, I have 150 more questions, but I think that'll have to be a part 2, because this has been a great accumulation of what you guys do. And I think lots of thoughts for athletes looking to play in college. So thank you so much for coming. And again, thank you so much for your time. Awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on.
Where can the people find you if they have questions, if they want to follow your content, if they want to join Soccer Sig, whatever? Where can people find you online?
Yeah, so they can find me everywhere. So I'm on Twitter, _Alex_NG. That's my last name. It's only 2 letters. I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, anything they want. And then, so I'm obviously I hold my CSCS, and I'm part of the National Strength and Conditioning Association. And I'm also an executive council member on the Soccer Special Interest Group. That's the SIG, S-I-G. So we have a Facebook group. If you want to join that, I'm one of the main people that sees people entering. So anybody that wants to join our special interest group, I try to post a pretty good amount of video clips of what we do here at IU, from warm-ups to some of our sports performance stuffs. And it's just really an open discussion. I think the
Yeah.
main goal of that special interest group is to bridge this gap between sport coaches and strength conditioning coaches. So whether
Yeah.
you're an athlete, a sport coach, a strength coach, I think that group is for everybody, because the
Mhm.
ultimate goal is to kind of bridge that gap of basically what we're talking about and basically my job right now of making sure we can combine those two and just have an open communication between those two worlds that I think have a very unique relationship.
Uh, Definitely very unique.
Yeah,
But very cool. And I think the future of it is going to be really awesome as well as we learn
for
how to
sure,
understand each other and get better at all of this.
for
The whole
sure.
data thing is a little bit new. The whole multi personnel, multidisciplinary groups is a little bit new. So balancing act. But I definitely also can second that and recommend people join that group because it is really awesome. We have fun in there
For
sometimes.
sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex, for coming on. We'll see you later.